Well, welcome to the politics of joy and justice, as we like to call it. And you see where you all started here? It's going right across the country. And a major progressive political reform movement is going to run through that tape on November 7th with millions of voters behind us, and then on to victories in future elections. Yesterday I was in Wisconsin, and I was told in a little town called Belleville, Wisconsin, there were several dozen people parading down the street in one of the traditional parades, and they were handing out this little package. It says, "Plant a seed for democracy, vote for Nader LeDuc." And these are organic seeds for pole beans, peas, corn, sunflowers, tomatoes, hot peppers, lettuce, and okra. 3 weeks ago in Colorado, we were driving toward Denver, and we saw a billboard. And the billboard was a billboard for our candidacy, and they gave us one of the best slogans of the year. They said, "Vote Nader LeDuc, who put human need over corporate greed." You know what it takes to build a major new party. It takes people who don't settle for the lesser of two evils, who don't go for the least of the worst. And it takes people who are pioneers, and then others will follow them. It takes people who aren't going to be swayed by these surrogates for Al Gore, who never had the guts to confront my positions on the presidential debates, and he's sending off these surrogates. These are the same surrogates who couldn't get their calls returned from the Clinton-Gore administration for 8 years, and who filled our ears complaining about how terrible this administration is on environment, how terrible they are on forest policy, how terrible they are on WTO and NAFTA, and how terrible they are in the auto industry, and how terrible they are in backing off from universal health insurance, and how weak they are on civil rights, and how atrocious they are on civil liberties. And what are these people doing? They're going around the country trying to salvage Al Gore's campaign. You see what lesser of two evils gives you? First, it gives you Clinton for 8 years, and they want more of the same just because the Republicans are worse? Don't we deserve the best? Don't we deserve the better? Look, it's not generally known how bad Clinton Gore have been on civil rights and civil liberties. It is terrible. The Immigration Act of 1996, the Welfare Act in 1996, the laws that have shredded the precious right of habeas corpus, that have provided the use of secret evidence by the INS against immigrants, that has moved our country downhill. Anthony Lewis, who's a columnist for the New York Times for 40 years, and he's pro-Clinton. He's written 30 columns in the last 6 years documenting the Clinton civil liberties record as, quote, abysmal, end quote, and the worst in 50 years. This is what we were supposed to expect the Democrats to be good at, civil liberties and civil rights. Amazing. Here are civil rights leaders who are going for the least worst. Not the great leaders like Randall Robinson and Cornel West, who support our candidacy. even though they know that Justice Department lawyers today in the Civil Division have said that in litigation enforcement, the Clinton-Gore administration is worse than Reagan-Bush in 2 out of 3 major areas. They're worse on affirmative action, they're worse on illegal use of police violence, they're only better in anti-housing discrimination cases. And do you know there's been a precipitous drop in the prosecution of environmental crimes by the Justice Department? And you know that the motor vehicle industry in Detroit hasn't had to lift their fuel efficiency standards to reduce pollution and greenhouse gases and give your family budget a break in 8 years. Not a single proposed fuel efficiency standard. It's going backwards. It's down to 24.5 miles per gallon. That's the lowest it's been since Reagan got elected, 1980. And notice, can the Republicans be any worse than that? Can the Republicans be any worse than running a Food and Drug Administration, the FDA, that is worse than it's ever been in 29 years, according to the chief watchdog on that agency, Dr. Sidney Wolf? Can the Republicans have been any worse than OSHA, the job safety agency we worked so hard to create in 1970, which in 8 years, with 56,000 workers dying every year from toxic particulates and trauma in the workplace, has not issued one chemical toxic control standard? That's never happened in any 8-year history of OSHA since we got that bill through in 1970. Can the Republicans be any worse than Clinton-Gore on WTO, GATT, and NAFTA? For heaven's sakes, Clinton-Gore were pushing the Republicans on WTO and NAFTA. Can the Republicans be any worse than the refusal of Clinton-Gore to take a stand to give America a raise and to give millions of workers a living wage where they can't even earn enough, even though they work full-time? 47 million workers, 1 out of 3 in this country, do not make a living wage. They make $5.50 an hour, 10 million of them, at the federal minimum wage, and the rest don't make much more. $5, $6, $7, $8, $9 an hour before you deduct the costs of getting to work. Another car, another auto insurance policy, another repair bill, more daycare costs. People today are earning less in real dollars. The majority of the workers earning less in real dollars, according to the Department of Labor, than 20 years ago, than 25 years ago. The federal minimum wage in purchasing power today, consider this one, is $2.15 less than what it was in 1968, adjusted for inflation, to the present day, which would have had it at $7.30. Just think of that. Booming economy, the top 10% of the richest people in this country making out very well, the top 1% net wealth equal to the net wealth of the bottom 95%, and Bill Gates in January of this year's net wealth was equal to the combined net worth of 120 million poorest Americans. That's 40% of the entire nation. And whatever that says about the great software imitator in nearby Redmond, what does it say? What does it say? What does it say about millions of workers, year after year, decade after decade, and they're essentially broke? They're just working paycheck to paycheck. If they're really poor and in the ghettos, payday loans to payday loans at horrendous loan shark interest rates, 2, 3, 4, 500% on the rollover, in addition to the rent-to-own rackets and all the other abuses, in addition to the redlining, the pulling out of banks and insurance companies from low and moderate income neighborhoods. You tell me, can the Republicans have been worse on these issues? Can the Republicans have been worse on the booming corporate welfare expenditures, your tax dollars going to pharmaceutical industries, giant agribusiness, giveaways, handouts, going to the mineral companies, the timber companies, the gold companies, the oil, the gas companies? Every corporation of any size goes to Washington with its handout, gimme, 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 and you're paying. And next time they tell you that there's not enough tax dollars to repair and expand your schools and your community health clinics and your libraries and your cultural activities and your drinking water systems and your public transit systems. You tell them, how come there are hundreds of billions of our tax dollars for stadiums and for drug companies and for military contractors? By the way, it wasn't Bush or Gore who came to Seattle to fight against that stadium boondoggle, which we just barely lost, 49-51, after Paul Allen paid the legislature to have a special election. Can you imagine that? In June, he said, I want a special election. I'll pay for all the precincts. Then he pumped $5 million into TV, misleading the people here, thinking it was only the sports fans that were going to pay. Well, they were going to pay, but others taxpayers were too. And even so, we almost beat them, just losing 51-49. Where was Al Gore? Where was George W. Bush, huh? By the way, that's why you got to vote against this initiative 745, which would allocate 90% of your state and local transportation funds to highways and not the super new public transit that is available. The engineers are ready to go, but there's no money for these elevated sky trains and all the other ways that we can get around underground without being in choking traffic, bumper to bumper, breathing the air, wasting our time, spending money, incurring accidents often, and getting to work or home fatigued. All because the giant highway lobby, led by the asphalt paving industry, wants to get this I-745 down so you can spend more time being stripped of your local autonomy. So elderly and disabled people can spend more time desperately trying to find a way to get to work because they can't drive a car or they can't own a car. So that the asphalt industry can pour more asphalt and more bumper-to-bumper traffic. These are the issues that really matter. These are the issues that really matter. It's time to take a stand. It's time to vote your conscience. You know what happens when you vote your conscience? Huh? You feel pretty good when you get up the next morning. Now, if you want to vote for the same old politics as usual and send these guys back to office in Washington, D.C. so they can continue to knuckle under corporate extremists who are pillaging and plundering our environment, defrauding and cheating consumers, blocking universal health insurance coverage, the same corporate extremists who have bought, rented, and corrupted our politics and our elections and hijacked our democracy. You want more of that? Go vote for Al Gore. Go vote for George W. Bush, who's really a corporation running for president disguised as a person. You want more failed war on drugs? Tens of billions of dollars down the drain. The communities are still endangered. Our police are still endangered. Drug addicts are sent to jail at $40,000 a year on the taxpayer into corporate prisons that are building our greatest public housing project in this country. It's called jail cells. Literally, more jail cells than public housing is being built in the last 10 years. We have more people in jail in our country than there are farmers. Imagine that. 2 million people are in jail. In New York State, 94% of the 27,000 people who are in jail for nonviolent drug offenses. That is, possession and use, not sale, not drug dealers. 94% just happen to be people of color, even though far more white people and middle and upper income people are using drugs. They don't get caught, of course, you see. So this is really a war on people of color. We don't send alcoholics to jail in this country. We don't send nicotine addicts to jail in this country. They kill far more Americans, far, far more. Why are we sending drug addicts to jail instead of rehabilitating? Give them a health problem. It's cheaper and more humane. You see any difference between Gore and Bush on that? No. They don't even want to ask about it. I mean, Jim Lehrer, he didn't even ask. I mean, you know, it was over. I mean, on that second debate, I counted 32 times they agreed with one another, Bush and Gore. In fact, Bush was so exhausted agreeing with Gore, he started agreeing with Clinton. Neither Bush and Gore have the courage to say that if they were elected, they would repeal the notorious Taft-Hartley Act of 1947. That's a chokehold on tens of millions of Walmart workers and McDonald's workers and other workers who work every day a full week and can't get a living wage because they can't surmount all the obstacles and other labor laws, state and federal, that make it harder to form a trade union in this country than any other Western country in the world. And it shows, doesn't it? Not only do we have the majority of the workers slipping behind in a boom economic period, according to the Department of Labor, as I said, not only do we have 46 million people without health insurance coverage, 10 million more than what was the case when Clinton and Gore took office with all their promises. Not only do we have a minimum wage that's way beyond that of 1968, but we have people so desperately trying to make ends meet that they're going into deeper and deeper and deeper consumer debt, which now is $6.2 trillion. And just consider what could happen if we had labor laws that gave workers the facilities to collectively bargain. There'd be 20, 30 million more workers in democratic unions to counteract the power of corporations. Maybe those corporate executives who are making $50, $100, $200 million a year have to share some of that money with the workers who made those profits possible. I see that sign over there, Labor for Nader. I want to thank the Teamsters local here in Seattle and the Postal Workers local who went against the grain and endorsed this candidacy. Corporate crime enforcement. You ever hear Bush or Gore say that if elected they're going to be tough on corporate crime? Wow, they'd have bitten their tongue on that one, huh? And yet, the Wall Street Journal, New York Times, 60 Minutes, 2020, they're always giving you investigative stories on corporate crime, fraud, abuse against taxpayers, corporate welfare boondoggles, ripping off consumers, HMOs, banks, insurance companies, taking the hide out of small investors, investor fraud, ripping off the government, taxpayers. These stories go nowhere. They go nowhere because we have two political parties who are raising tens of millions of dollars from these corporate crooks, and they're not going to send prosecutors after them. When you add it up, Corporate welfare boondoggles bleeding neighborhoods and communities from necessary public investment in enriching the rich and the richer. The loss of local, state, and national sovereignty to WTO and NAFTA. The non-movement on universal health insurance coverage, with more millions of children, men and women, not getting health care coverage every month. Consumers who work hard and try to get value for their dollars, getting ripped off in systemic frauds that they're not even aware of, like the $110 billion they ripped off in this country by the healthcare industry due to billing fraud and abuse, those computerized bills that are in code and nobody can understand. According to the General Accounting Office, that was their figure, 10% of the healthcare dollar. When you see this, the similarity in foreign policy of these two parties, you really can't tell them apart. They're still using your tax dollars and using your tax dollars to sell weapons to dictators and authoritarian regimes and oligarchs and that repress their people. Wouldn't it be nice to have a government that stood tall, rooted in a deep democracy, and said to the people of the world, this country, consistent with national jurisdiction and international law, is only going to support the forces of democracy and the interests of the workers and the peasants in the third world. We spend more on one wing of a B-2 bomber that goes for $2 billion that the Pentagon doesn't want any more of, but the manufacturers are pushing through Congress and with their fundraising dinners. Listen to this one. About 2 years ago, I went over to the Walter Reed Institute of Health under the U.S. Army, Pentagon, in Maryland. And there were PhDs and MDs from the Army and Navy who ran and do run the government's only drug company. 33 years ago, the Pentagon gave up on the pharmaceutical industry that wasn't interested in researching vaccines and drugs against malaria and other global infectious diseases. The second leading cause of hospitalization in Vietnam for U.S. troops was malaria. And so they went to work, and they have produced one drug after another against global infectious diseases, and under government policy, they have to give it away to one or more drug companies, free, no royalties. So I was over there around the table sitting with them discussing. I said, what's your budget? This is an amazing thing. 3 million people every year, many of them kids, die from tuberculosis and malaria, 700,000 African kids a year. And look at, of course, AIDS and all kinds of others. Ebola now spreading from northern Uganda down to southern Uganda. West Nile virus is in a 300-mile arc around New York City. That came from overseas too. And AIDS came from overseas too. We have an interest in mounting a global anti-infectious disease research program, and we're not doing it. So I'm over there talking with the captains, the ensigns, and the colonels, all PhDs or MDs. And I said, what's your research budget? You've already discovered, tested, and sent to market 3 out of the 4 leading anti-malarial drugs. You just did a great hepatitis drug. What's your research budget for the year? It's at $25 million. So I'm thinking of the $2 billion B-2 bomber that has no longer any strategic use. The Pentagon doesn't want any more of them. Congress is shoving 10 more down the Pentagon's throat. It has trouble flying in the rain, and there's no more Soviet Union to which it was originally developed. So I asked the high-ranking officer, I said, sir, how much more would you like? Because they were talking about great discoveries in the pipeline, they have money for clinical testing. How much would you like next year in terms of a piece of the B-2 bomber? What would be the dollar equivalent? Without hesitation, he said, a wheel. I blushed. I blushed with shame. I blushed with shame because our citizenry doesn't have the power and the tools to redirect that military budget to necessary national defense needs, not the corporate greed of the weapons contractors. And we don't have the power to give those scientists who are very dedicated. They're not interested in profit. They could go and triple their pay in some of these drug companies. The wherewithal to mount a successful assault on global infectious diseases that are coming to this country in drug-resistant strains like tuberculosis. These are the issues that count. This is where we have to take a stand. This is where we have to say to the naysayers, to the wafflers, to the waverers, don't go for the lesser of two evils, because at the end of the day, you end up with evil. Where are the two parties on public transit? You see much difference? You ever see it even mentioned? Do you know how many billions of hours we waste in bumper-to-bumper traffic? Because years ago, GM, Standard Oil of California, Firestone, conspired to rip up electrified trolley systems in 28 major metropolitan areas in the 30s and early 40s. They were convicted by the Justice Department in Chicago after World War II as one of the greatest continuing economic crimes of the century. And you see Al Gore, George W. Bush coming up against the highway lobby. I can go on and show you, and I know you know yourself, that the massive similarities between these two parties on taking away the power of the people, hijacking our democracy, selling our precious government, which is supposed to be our servant, to giant corporations, which turn this government against its own people. These and other similarities I mentioned far outweigh, far overshadow, far tower over whatever dwindling differences in reality that remain between these two corrupt political parties. Remember, those same civil rights leaders that are supporting Gore and Clinton should realize that it was Clinton Gore that expanded the federal death penalty. It was Clinton Gore that is pushing corporate prisons. It was Clinton Gore that wants more money for the failed war on drugs. It was Clinton Gore who haven't done anything about 200,000 minority kids who are poisoned every year because of lead-based paint peeling off crumbling tenement walls. It was Clinton Gore who haven't done anything other than the earned income credit. They really haven't done much about poverty. Poverty's at 20% in our country. In the Netherlands, it's 3%, and they're ashamed of it. Scandinavia, less. Look at the Western European governments. Right out of World War II, when they were almost reduced to rubble, in the 50s and 60s, they gave their people universal health care coverage, which we do not have. They gave their people, for all workers, mandatory paid vacations, full maternity leave paid, full sick leave paid, and adequate facilities to form unions, and good public transit systems. None of this occurs in this country because we have too much power and too much wealth in the hands of the few, as Justice Louis Brandeis said in 1941. Justice Louis Brandeis really put it very well in 1941, and I like to quote him. He said, quote, We can have a democracy, or we can have the concentration of great wealth in the hands of the few. We cannot have both." End quote. President, besides Jefferson and Madison and Lincoln and Teddy Roosevelt, who warned about the concentration of wealth in too few hands and the concentration of power that goes with it, Teddy Roosevelt called them the malefactors of great wealth. Franklin Delano Roosevelt called them the economic royalists. We call them the multinational global corporations. And it was President Woodrow Wilson who said, "There is a power rising in this country." This was almost 100 years ago. "There is a power rising in this country that is more powerful than the United States government." And he was referring to the giant corporate trusts of those days, the timber trusts and the steel corporations and the big banking Goliaths. And of course, they're bigger than ever. And now they're crumbling their opposition. The unions are weaker. The environmental and consumer groups can't get anything done in Washington because they're being closed out by this morphing two-party system into a single corporate party, fed every day by the same corporate interests that run the permanent corporate government in Washington. You know, Bush and Gore don't matter much. They're just battling over who's going to go into the White House and take the marching orders from their corporate paymasters. It's the permanent corporate government that matters. It's the permanent corporate government. Make a list of departments and agencies in our government: Treasury, Defense, State Department, Federal Reserve, Departments of Commerce, Labor, Agriculture, Food and Drug Administration, Auto Safety Agency, OSHA, you name it. 22,000 corporate lobbyists working every day and 9,000 corporate PACs. They're the ones that control those departments and agencies. The margins are fiddled at by the Republicans and the Democrats. But the real power is the corporate government in Washington that is there regardless of whether it's a Republican in the White House or a Democrat in the White House. And they are now diminishing to a point of insignificance. So when people say to you, "Well, I think I've got to vote for Al Gore because although I agree with you that the two parties are the same on many issues, it's the Supreme Court." Haven't you heard that one? Well, here's what you remind your Democratic friends. Ask them why the Democratic Party sent Justice Scalia and Justice Thomas to the Supreme Court. I fought day after day against Scalia, and you know what I got for it? Every Democratic senator joined every Republican senator and confirmed him 98-0, including Al Gore, who confirmed Scalia, and these groups that are representing him. I say, who are the two worst justices? Ask your Democratic friends. They'll say Scalia and Thomas. Why would you support Al Gore, who voted to confirm Scalia, who's about anti-consumer, anti-environment, and who wants to repeal Roe versus Wade? Why would these Democrats lecture you on the Supreme Court when Clarence Thomas won 52-48 after the Anita Hill hearings, with 11 Democratic senators bringing him over the top in a Senate that was controlled by the Democratic Party majority and George Mitchell? They're the ones who sent these two men to the Supreme Court, and then they turn around and say, "Oh, vote for Al Gore and Joe Lieberman." Joe Lieberman was about to vote for Clarence Thomas until I had a session with him in his office and changed his mind just before the vote, for which he thanked me a year later. You see, this illustrates a very important point about the Democrats. They say things differently. They don't do things differently. They don't fight. They're not fighters for even what they believe in. How do you characterize a personality like that? Huh? I mean, if you believe in protecting our national forests for present and future generations, how could you not also believe in abolishing the commercial logging on national forests? How can... And putting the $1.2 billion in taxpayer subsidies to the big timber companies into job creation, far more than the logging, into job creation to restore, preserve, and protect our forests for recreation and ecotourism, and proudly able to hand them forward to our children and grandchildren. It's a plus all around. We only get 3% of our timber harvest from the national forest, and that's less than what we can recover from waste timber thrown into landfills. And yet you can't get Al Gore, never mind George Bush, who believes in stumps. You can't get Al Gore. You can't get Al Gore even to come out for something like that. He's supposed to be an environmentalist. The other day he said, I'll stack my environmental record against anyone else, including him. He's getting close to mentioning my name. Him. So I took up his challenge. I took up his challenge, remembering how I was on the front lines for the EPA getting through Congress, for OSHA getting through Congress, that's pollution in the workplace, for the air and water pollution laws in the early 70s, tremendous battles, and right down the line, Clean Water Drinking Act, 1974. And so I wrote Al Gore a letter. I said, Dear Vice President Gore, I heard that you just said you're willing to stack your environmental record up against anyone, including me. So why don't you read the rest of the letter, where I went through one area after another where he's betrayed the people in this country: motor vehicle fuel efficiency, the Everglades, the incinerator in East Liverpool, the subsidies that continue under his regime to fossil fuel and nuclear power, WTO, NAFTA, on and on. And then I ended it saying, let's have a public discussion so we can compare our records and have the media there, have people around the country. Of course, that was about the 20th letter I've sent since March to Al Gore, and he's never replied. He didn't reply to that. Isn't that interesting? You know, I get asked by the press, am I worried about electing Al Gore? I said, no, I'm worried about Al Gore taking votes away from us. Yes. But you know, obviously for months the Democratic Party told the press, when asked, they're not worried about this candidacy. They're not losing any sleep, as one Gore representative said, over this candidacy. They are now. And it's because of you. It's because of people all over the country. Great volunteers, coordinators, canvassers, people who are generating word of mouth, serious political, progressive talk about where our country should go in the future, where our world should go. People who no longer are going to stay home. People who are not going to have their time trivialized. People who have a higher estimate of their own significance as citizens to build a strong, just democracy. Do you want a new, growing political party that wants to expand solar energy here and around the world and means it? You want a political party that 50 years after President Truman proposed universal health care coverage and was rebuked by Congress under the influence of the American Medical Association? Do you want a party that will drive to universal health care coverage that's accessible with an emphasis on prevention of disease and trauma and really mean it? Yeah! Do you want a political party that will give the 6-month notice of withdrawal from WTO and NAFTA and renegotiate international trade agreements to pull standards up, not pull standards down? Seattle, all right. And by the way, you're looking at the only presidential candidate who has read every page of the GATT agreement and NAFTA agreement. Al Gore just works off memos prepared for him by business lobbies and filtered. You know, there's only one senator who ever read the WTO agreement, and no members of the House read it. We did a canvass, we offered a prize, we did everything to try to get him to read it. It was Senator Hank Brown took our challenge, Republican Colorado. We gave him a month to read it before the vote, 1995. He was a NAFTA supporter, he voted for it, he was a free trader. He read it, and he told us in front of all the press in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee room that he's going to vote against the WTO because it's so anti-democratic he couldn't tolerate it. And he did. You know, you can tell a candidate by who the chief advisors are. And the chief advisors to Bush and Cheney are right out of the big business establishment. But you may be surprised to know who the chief advisors are in this political campaign to Al Gore. Try Carter Eskew, who lobbied successfully against the tobacco regulation bill sponsored by John McCain a couple years ago in the U.S. Senate as a paid lobbyist for the tobacco moguls. Try Jack Quinn, who came out of a big corporate law firm in Washington and had represented corporations that wanted federal legislation to tie the hands of your judges and juries so that you don't get your full day in court if you're wrongfully injured by a defective automobile or other defective product or toxic materials. Try Peter Knight, very close inner circle. He represented the pharmaceutical industries that were trying to browbeat, with Al Gore's help, the South African government in not passing a compulsory licensing bill to bring down the horrendously high prices of AIDS medicines so that their people could have a chance to live or live a little longer. You understand that the general manager of his campaign, the top guy, former Secretary of Commerce Bill Daley, who shepherded through NAFTA and WTO, the U.S. Congress, helping Bill Clinton. This is what's going on here. Next time a Democrat comes up to you and says, you got to switch your vote to Al Gore because George W. Bush is so much worse, I think you can draw them both with similar patterns in issue after issue that really count, that really mean something to the American people, issue after issue where those two men are on the wrong side. And I would like all of you in the next few days, on behalf of the Nader LeDuc candidacy, to fan out throughout the state and to persuade and to urge and to challenge the best instincts of your fellow workers and neighbors and acquaintances and relatives, and tell them something quite simple. Do they like what's been going on in Washington? Do they like corporations who are collapsing our democracy, hijacking our government while they deepen their hooks and their dollar bills in both political parties? Do they want all of these subject matters to go untreated? Do they want business as usual? If they do, they know who they can vote for. But if they want to build a permanent new party that is rooted in the community, that is receiving the experience and the commitment of citizen activists who have been closed out of their own government by corporate power and now must build a new political reform movement. Do they want to be part of that? If they want to be part of that, the doors are open for everyone. There is no party that has a better civil rights and civil liberties platform, no party that has a better record of challenging the power brokers, no party whose candidates have a better record of resisting all temptation as they stare the future of our country in the eye and try to build it to higher and higher levels. The Democratic pundits are telling the press that the Green Party supporters are going to, in significant numbers, change their mind in the voting booth. Let me hear your answer to that. You know, no matter who's nominated in any year for the presidential ticket of the Republican Democratic Party, and we have two hereditary politicians, Bush and Gore, they get millions of hereditary voters, people whose great-grandparents were either Republicans or Democrats. They don't even have to fight for those voters. They're almost automatic. But we are appealing to the independent voters, the voters who've dropped out and don't vote, the young voters in the millions who are turning 18 or are on college campuses and universities and come to our rallies in great numbers and committed themselves to more in this vicious election. We are saying to the millions of voters who voted for Perot and McCain and Bradley and Jesse Ventura, voters who for various reasons voted for these candidates, but they had one reason in common. They knew dirty politics when they saw it, and they wanted candidates who would go and do something about it with their support back home. And we want to appeal to all those voters because McCain, Bradley, and Perot are not on the ballot. It's only the Nader Leduc candidacy that's carrying that reform torch steadfastly all the way through November and beyond. No, in case anybody thinks that these issues and the stands that the Green Party takes on these issues are marginal, let me show you the September 11th, 2000 issue of Business Week. That's the establishment business magazine. Huge circulation. Full of full-page ads from GM, IBM, General Electric, you name it. And they're asking, too much corporate power? And in devastating page after devastating page about corporate abuses against the American people and the political system, Business Week magazine answers, yes, yes, yes. And in an editorial at the end states, quote, corporations should get out of politics, end quote. And then polling the American people, they report 72% of the American people polled said yes to the question, is there too much corporate power over all aspects of your life? There sure is. People feel they're losing control over everything that matters to them. Their workplace, their marketplace, their government, their children, their schools, their environment, their right to choose their own doctor and lawyer. They're losing control over everything that matters to them, whether they call themselves conservatives, liberals, moderates, radicals, whatever. It's that common feeling of loss of control that we want to pay attention to. Because if the people in this country do not reassert their sovereignty over this nation, and if they don't replace the unprecedented power of corporations over our political economy, over our media, our country will still enrich a few at the top, but it will leave many people behind, not just economically, not just in health and safety, but in a sense of hopelessness, in a sense of powerlessness, in a sense of the apathy that hopelessness and powerlessness produces. And when that happens, the creative greatness of a people is suppressed, it's commercialized, it's channeled inward so nobody can feel, see, hear, and witness its great benefits. If we need to get motivation, we only need to look at our forebears in the struggle against slavery, for women's rights, for trade union rights, for farmer populist progressive movement that swept the country and gave us so many benefits decades later. We only need to see how people put it on the line in the 20th century for civil rights, for gay and lesbian rights, for the great resurgence of the women's rights movement, the consumer, the environmental movements. They didn't quit. They didn't waver. They weren't dissuaded. They didn't go for the lesser of two evils. They went for justice. They looked destiny in the eye and met it. My friends, extremism are corporations who poison our environment and degrade it, not the Green Party that wants a clean, wholesome, sustainable, renewal environment. Extremism are corporations who so contaminate our political process that they nullify our votes with money, with cash register politics equally transferred to Republicans and Democrats. It's not extremism for the Green Party to drive for clean money, clean elections through public funding of public elections. Extremism is commercializing the very notion of childhood, commercially exploiting 2, 3, 5, 6, 7-year-olds with over-medication, junk food, violent programming, and worse. Why don't they leave our children alone? Because they want to make more profit out of separating those children from their parents, who are often away, commuting long distances back and forth. They don't even know the decent boundaries of staying away from the parent-child relationship. Their greed is so overwhelming in their pursuit of profits. You can elaborate your own applications of extremism. Extremism are employers who refuse to clean up toxic conditions in the workplace. They give workers cancer and respiratory ailments, such as in coal mines, or textile mills, or foundries, or steel plants, or auto plants. Extremism is stripping us of our own sovereignty into autocratic secret systems of governance, literally, called the World Trade Organization, NAFTA, which subordinate the health and safety standards and the improvement thereof to the dictates of international commerce, trade uber alles, and do so by bringing our standards down rather than bringing other third world countries' standards up, like trial labor. 1 million people devoting 100 hours a year of volunteer time and raising $100 into the Green Party, building it. We'll have a majority party in many fewer years than most people would expect, because we're putting forward an agenda that respects not only the interest and rights of all people, but says that the only way you can further these rights and your legitimate interests and pass your country to your descendants in ways that your descendants would be proud of you, and pass this world to their descendants, having had the United States of America help raise the rest of the world to be what it should be and what it could be. Can you imagine any better legacy than that? 1 million. What is 1 million Americans? 100 hours, $100. That's not one of history's great sacrifices, is it? That's the great position your generation is in. Future generations will look back and say, this generation either refused to give up so little to achieve so much, or this generation stood tall. This generation said that the pursuit of justice is one of the great works of human beings on earth, and that freedom to mean anything must mean participation in power, and that what our forebears gave us, we must use and elevate into the practical applications of humane, constructive, and respectful solutions to systemic injustices and deteriorations. I just leave you with this last note. Going all over the country, immense talent came out. People connected with one another. People started running for local office, as you have seen here earlier, and state and federal office. But most important is the sense that I felt when I was going in rural country and saw small farmers being squeezed out of their livelihood by U.S. Department of Agriculture policies that propped up the giant agribusiness. Small farmers abandoning their farms or selling out to bigger and bigger farms, with towns and villages in Iowa and Nebraska and elsewhere moving toward desolation. The loss of rural America and the small farm economy is important to us as urbanites and suburbanites. And when I saw these people say, the U.S. Department of Agriculture is our enemy, I was further confirmed in the notion that if we ever again say that our government is our enemy, it's because we're looking in the mirror, and it's because we didn't take it back, and it's because we didn't vote on November 7th for the political party that's going to take it back. Thank you.